So after 1880, Russians began to put down much stronger roots in Central Asia. It was really the railway that changed everything. Before, you had military goals, and now you had increasingly economic goals. Now, these were always there to a certain degree, but now, and especially as I mentioned, cotton after the 1860s becomes increasingly important. People realize they can't depend on the United States anymore, other cotton producers, and so they want to grow more and more cotton here. Turkestan, which is what this area is known as at the time, becomes an important provider of cotton. By 1890, over half of Russia's demand for cotton is supplied by Central Asia. So the Central Asian economy, in turn, is increasingly invested in cotton. By 1899, 70% of local industrial production is in the cotton industry. This was immediately problematic. It would have awful long-term ramifications, which we'll get to later. You've already seen a picture of the Aral Sea. But immediately you had dependence. The Fergana Valley, for example, was this lush valley, and I've pointed to it before on the map, and it went from being this fruit and grain producer to cotton. 40% of the land went to cotton. The result was that you had shortages of fruit and grains, and you had to import them from other parts of the empire, whereas this area used to be self-sufficient on that account. A dependence on cotton also made Central Asia subject to world prices, supply and demand. And this is a commodity, and as all economists will tell you, commodities are horrible things to base your economy on because the prices fluctuate wildly. There was also a reliance on very primitive tools here in the cotton industry, meaning that cotton harvesting required much labor. And still today in Central Asia, you have what is essentially slave labor picking the cotton. And there have been various campaigns against this, something we'll talk about later. The peasants at the time really frequently bordered on slavery. They were working under feudal-like aristocracies, and there were also many slaves. You had about 20,000 formal slaves, and about 10,000, that was in Bukhara, about 10,000 in Samarkand. Mostly these were captured Iranians, and slaves were a sign of wealth and money. And so you actually had slavery within Central Asia. Throughout this period, though, more Russians were coming to Central Asia. At first, in the 1860s and 1870s, it was really only military and civil servants who were largely coming. Traders would pass through, but they weren't settling in Central Asia. These guys were overworked, they were underpaid, and again, they weren't, no offense to them, they weren't the brightest, they weren't the cream of the crop. By the mid-1880s, these communications improvements in travel made it much more appealing for other Russians to come as well. And so you had merchants coming into Turkestan, to Central Asia. You had technicians, you had railroad and industrial workers, you had business middlemen, financiers, agricultural experts. And this also had this Australia effect, where Russian exiles would come in. They were often criminals, what some called a movement of the destitute. If you had nowhere else to go, if you were just released from prison, if you broke out of prison, where'd you go? You went to Central Asia. One observer commented, quote, "Nearly everyone who is here has either come here to avoid his creditors or been sent away to keep out of some scrape, or has come on account of increased pay or the shorter time of service necessary before receiving a pension, or in the hope of making a rapid fortune." So by this point, Russians had taken over local administration for the most part. One of the other major groups that came in the late 1800s was peasants, and I alluded to this before. This is incredibly important. Recall that in 1860, the serfs, these Russian peasant slaves, were freed. You had the division and distribution of communal lands, which left some of these people with nothing. So you had people who were increasingly hungry, they were increasingly rebellious. Many illegal peasants moved into Central Asia to take land. This was the Wild East. At first, they were forced out by the Russian government. And then the Russian government realized that this wasn't a curse. This was actually a cure. This was a safety valve. And so they had severe agrarian and industrial distress in European Russia. And by this point, this was feeding this revolutionary fervor. You had anarchists and Marxists who were starting to speak out in Russia. You had also a broad ideological swath within Russia that supported the expansion into Central Asia. And this didn't just come from one group. This came from nationalists who felt that it was their destiny to go into Central Asia, as nationalists said all around Europe when they were talking about their colonial entities. And it also came from liberals. Let's go civilize the natives. Right? So Russia began to establish a resettlement administration. And it now flooded Russia with propaganda saying, go south, go east, go down into Central Asia. And the people followed. You had enormous numbers. From 1893 to 1905, 400,000 people went from Russia into what is now present-day Kazakhstan, so northern Turkestan, taking 40% of the Kazakh land. And this land was often the best land. By 1906, you had 200. In 1906 alone, you had 216,000. In 1907, you had 577,000 people going in. So increasingly, people were settling in the south. Now, in short, Central Asia became the dumping ground for Russia's problems. The Cossacks helped to keep order among them. These people came from semi-nomadic groups, these free communities that had moved around Russia for centuries, escaping brutality. But they gradually organized and seized prime steppe land. They essentially became the guardians of the Russian frontier. And this is what I mean, again, by going back to the Australia effect. These were sort of antagonistic groups. And by the 1800s, they became fierce loyalists to the Tsar as they occupied these territories. So between 1896 and 1916, in sum, about 1.5 million Russians came to Central Asia. Some oblasts or regions were dominated by Russians. The Steppe Oblast, for example, the Russian proportion of the population there rocketed from 20% in 1897 to 40% in 1911. So this was technically in what would later be called Kazakhstan. This was in Turkestan. But it was almost equally Russian. Russians farmed between 64% and 96% of the cultivated land in that area, in the Steppe Oblast. In another northern oblast, Russians in 1911 were 58% of the population, actually a majority of the population in this region. Many people also went into the cities. Many Russians also went into the cities of Central Asia. So you had an increased proportion of Europeans in urban areas. By 1889, for example, about 20% of Tashkent was Russian. About 50% of Samarkand was Russian. The Central Asian way of life was really upset by the influx of Russians. Culturally, they were from different worlds. They didn't merge. This was prompted by the fact that, one, there was a purely military character of Russians at first, and then two, there was this lack of wealthy or elite types among the natives. And so the Russians came and they very much separated themselves from the natives. Native customs were actually left alone at first, common under empires. Local commanders who became administrators restricted the inflow of Orthodox missionaries and really allowed the native religious schools to continue because they didn't want to see problems. They were interested in stability. Natives, though, were living in sort of civil purgatory. They lacked full rights, but they also didn't have obligations common of Russians, like military service. They didn't have to do that. But as Russian immigrants felt more secure and they were greater in numbers as time went on, they became much more demanding. By the 1880s, General Kaufman, who had administered Turkestan, was out, and his replacements came down and they clamped down. They discouraged pilgrimages to Mecca by devout Muslims. They merged Russian and religious schools. They increased secular education. They attacked the local way of life in lots of ways. For example, the nomadic way of life in the region was upset. Traditional patterns, nomadic migration, was disrupted. It was blocked. People were pressured to take up farming. By 1916, 30% of Kazakhs were forced to settle down, but they had little or no land. The land that they had was the bad land because the Russians had come in to take the good land. Russian garrisons, military garrisons, meant that Europe was in Central Asia. So cities had been Asiatic before. They were loud, they were crowded, they were narrow, they had narrow winding streets, a citadel, a bazaar, a few mosques and schools and lines of flat-roofed houses made out of sun-dried brick, like villages but bigger. But now the architecture and the feel of the cities was transformed by the Russians. They built these wide, long, straight boulevards, these grand public buildings. This was a major contrast. It was Europe going into Central Asia. Another thing they imported was drunkenness, alcoholism. Troops received liquor actually as part of their rations, and there was a lack of good drinking water there, coupled with the heat, which led to alcoholism. Now, the result of all this cultural repression, was more resistance, and there was increased revolt. There was a revolt in Tashkent in 1892. in Andijan in 1898. But resistance, for the most part, was largely sporadic, prompted by bread and butter issues. People couldn't afford to resist. And it was mostly limited to what we call weapons of the weak. In other words, foot dragging with respect to agricultural duties, failure to pay taxes, things like that. Things where it wasn't standing up and fighting, it was sort of shirking responsibilities or obligations. So, a very brief synopsis of Russian rule points out to some of the pros and cons of Russian rule down here. So some of the pros were that they did bring some semblance of order to the area, which again, under the Khanates, there was no order. There was this constant period of, it was a period of constant rebellion, I guess. They abolished slavery and cruel punishment. Take that with a grain of salt. There was some economic development. They had improved infrastructure, railroads, irrigation, improved agriculture. They started mining and manufacturing in Central Asia, where this hadn't been before. They brought some modern schools, newspapers, so they increased education in general. But the cons were also very salient. There was the spread of norms from Russia. So the spread of norms in colonial contexts can be a good thing, and it can be a bad thing. Here it was a particularly bad thing, because it wasn't how to run an honest and efficient administration. It was really how to run a dishonest and inefficient government. They deprived the region of educated native administrators by bringing their own drunken administrators, so they kept the administration to themselves. This left local elites really weakened compared to where they had been before. The education level also continued to remain relatively poor. The culture was undermined by external actors who touted themselves as these quote-unquote progressives and civilizers. There was also enormous economic pain. Cheap Russian goods hurt the local craftsmen, but much more importantly, the cotton monoculture hurt farmers and consumers. And many of these problems continue to today. So we'll stop there, and we'll go into the Soviet period in the next class.